to my YouTube channel. I know it's been long time that I haven't posted any video, but yeah, let's start again from today, where I would be trying to be more consistent and upload regular videos, at least one video per day that I'm targeting. So yeah, let's start with today's topic, which is webhooks. So most of you might be knowing what are webhooks. This is not specific to Unqork, but this is a kind of a jargon which is common in software development, right? And webhooks we can build in Unqork as well. But before going ahead with building the webhooks, right, in Unqork, let me just give you a quick walkthrough, like what are webhooks. Okay, so let's suppose you have application. So let me put it as a front end application. Okay, so this is a application where the UI part is only there, right? It is separate. It can be Unqork, it can be React, and it can be on Angular, anything, right? This is a UI part of application. And similarly, then we would be having the backend servers as well, where we would be having the APIs which are hosted on this server, right? So backend can have multiple operations like doing a lot of calculations, a lot of business logics, and a lot of things, right? And also they can be used further to save data into a database, right? Let's suppose a MongoDB database we have, and uh, this API processes the data, it formats the data as per the business logic and further stores those things into a database. So let's suppose user is doing his activity from UI. Okay, he's just navigating through the pages. Let's suppose he have done a complex uh, operation, maybe related to a business, where he's like adding the objects, a lot of things, right? It can be anything, maybe a simple form filling application, you can assume. Once he submits on that particular form, then he calls this particular API or this backend server, and this API further kicks in, which will start doing their business logic, right? Maybe if they want to calculate something based on the data which has been passed, and further they want to store that data into a database. So this entire operation is like time consuming, right? It is not something a synchronous operation that the user will click on the submit button and immediately the operation would be done, right? This entire operation might take some 2 to 3 minutes. So for that, what we can do, we can have a mechanism where the user is just doing a synchronous call. So what is synchronous call is basically he just transfers this data, he just calls the API, and API sends back the response immediately, which says maybe 200, right? Which means the data is received. So this particular transfer, right, UI to API is successful, and then it gives back a success response. But then it is a part of, or it is a job of API further to start with business logic, do the lot of computation, store into a DB, a lot of things, right? I'm not mentioning everything, but yeah, do all those operation. And once those are done, this backend server needs to notify the front end, right? That whatever the transaction you did, it took this many seconds or this much minutes, and it's now completed. So now there should be a mechanism where this server or this API is able to respond back to this application using something, right? So this is where the webhooks kicks in, right? So webhook is something notification mechanism, right? So kind of a HTTP request. It's not a different technology, it's just a HTTP request that a server, a backend server is doing to a front end, or this backend server can further also updates a different system, right? So we are having just one way communication, right? I mean, we are just having two systems, one is front end and this is back end, but there can be a different system altogether where this server wants to notify this party, this application, that this operation is done, and that's it. So Webhook is kind of giving a notification back to a particular system using a HTTP request. So here now what it will do, once the operation is done, it will just call this particular API, call this particular UI. So where to call is the front end need to have a service. So this service would be consumed by this backend server to pass on that message, right? Hey, so this particular operation is done and here is that. So this is kind of a two-way communication, right? Which will happen between UI to server and then server to UI back again. So this entire thing of server to front end, or maybe server to a different server, or notifying a particular system, this mechanism is called as webhook. So now we will see how to achieve this particular thing, how to build this part, right? Whatever this front end service which I talked about. So how to build this particular front end service on Unqork so that this service can be handed over or can be given to a different server to use, right? So they can call this service which is hosted on Unqork for notifying it. Okay, let's go to the Unqork. Okay, so let's start building a webhook. So I will just take this as a reference. So basically now what we are going to do, we are going to build a front end service in Unqork so that this can be given or handed over to a server which they will call. So how to do it is, it's pretty simple. So let's take this first. I will just show you what we need to do or how this works in Unqork. So now the first thing is like you need to have a variable which is called as underscore request. Okay, so let me give this property ID here. Okay, let me just toggle on this for some time. So what will happen is, let's suppose this is a module. So I have created a simple module which is having a type of API, and this particular module we are going to use as a webhook, right? So in simple terms, we are going to give this particular module, so this particular URL, not exactly this URL, but kind of that URL would be having this module ID to a backend server so that they can hit, and this particular module will be acting as an API or a front end service. So here I have created this underscore request as one variable. So I will tell you what is the reason of having particular this variable only but not the other. So now simple thing is just create a API, just create a module with type as API, and that's it, right? You can just have a logic here. So let's suppose we will just have a init. So this init will be triggered on new submission, and what this init will do is, let me put decision. So what this let me put it rule in only. So yeah, let me put, I will just create a variable which is called as response, and let me put a value here and value as success, right? So this rule I'm going to trigger with this initializer. So now let's go to, so let's take, this is our simple service, right? Where as soon as someone hits this particular service, this initializer would be triggering, and this service would just create a response value. Let me put a hidden variable also which is called as response. So this particular rule will just give this response variable the value as success, and that's it, right? So now what we need to do is, let me just give you the URL. So this is the URL. Let me just open this. So now what I have done, this is our module which I am using as a webhook. So the corresponding URL, right? So here when I said front end service, so this service would be having a URL, right, which we can pass on to this backend. So the URL would be like this. Okay, let me just paste it in this particular window. Okay, so this is what the URL would look like. So this first part, right, this all is again the domain in which you are working. So basically this is a training environment. That's why this part would remain same till 1.0, and the other part is modules. This would also be a constant part. So the dynamic part would be this, where we would be putting the module ID. So as I have created the module, this one, right, this is a module ID which I have created as a webhook. So that's why this is what I have put here in this URL. And then the last part slash API. So this is the endpoint, I would say, that backend system would be hitting to pass on the data, right? So as we don't have this backend system, let's use Postman to do that, right? So this is what I have done here. I have created a post request. This is the endpoint that I want to trigger, and I can create a body which would be a JSON, right? So let me put it here as request payload, and here I will write this is request from backend system. Okay, so this is what the payload that we are going to pass to this particular API. So if now I click on send, so see, now you can see this particular service acted as a API which we call, which this postman called, and this is what the request payload been passed to that particular thing, and in return it gave a success response, right, which is 200. And here you might be wondering like, what is this, right? Data result request. So what happens is, if you see here, this is what the request we have passed, right? This is the only thing that we have passed as a body from this postman. But here you can see this is what been created by Unqork, right? So anything that we pass in this, or anything that a backend system would pass, as soon as this payload reaches at Unqork layer, right? So this module will be called, and whatever the request or data which is been passed as a body from them, as soon as it enters into this Unqork arena, it would be wrapped in this fashion, right? It would be wrapped inside data, then result, and then the metadata we have, which is post, method, post, query, and now then we have a body. So this particular thing is wrapped inside this body, and now we have headers also, right? All of things. So if you see here, I have created a variable which is called as request. Okay, so the reason being, because anything that we passed gets wrapped under a request variable, right? If you see, so that's why I have created here a request variable, so that whatever the thing which are been passed are mapped to this particular thing, right? And now from this, let me just show you this thing where I would be getting the data, because now if you see, we have a request, and inside request we have a body. So now if I want to read this body and further the request payload, I need to traverse through this path where I would be doing request dot body, and then we have this request payload. So let me just create a data workflow quickly here. So what I will do here is I will just write here request, right? Why I'm writing request? Because that is where the entire thing is wrapped inside. So request, and then we have a body, and then we have a request payload. So now I'm just grabbing that part which I want, right? Or let me just save it in some variable here I will give it as, instead of response as success, what I will do here is the input which I have grabbed, and I'm going to store this thing into a response, right? And as you know, if you want to get these things right, if I want to see the response value, if I want to pass this response to the particular party which has been calling this particular service, I need to make this as store data in database. So that's in that way the user will be getting the response, and in that response they will be seeing the response parameter as well. So initially what we had done this init, the rule, this rule was further just hard coding the value of response to success, and that's it. So now let's try with that, and then we can integrate this data workflow with our actual rule. So let me do this send. So now if you see, we have we see a response here, right, which is success. So how we are able to see this response attribute? Because we have toggle this on, store data in database, and also we are able to see now this all things, right, which is request and everything, because we have toggled on this. If I toggled off this, we won't be able to see this part, right, which is under underscore request. We'll be only able to see the response here. So see that this is what we have got, because internally in Unqork this underscore request is there, and we know how it works. But it's just like we are not sending back to the user. We are just internally using this underscore request variable in this data workflow, as we know how this structure looks like. But now the response is just a success that isn't passed to the particular party which is calling this particular service. So now what I will do here is I will just call this data workflow, and here I will just trigger this, and this particular thing will just take the request body whatever we have, and it will store it in response. So now let's see what we see in response. So see what we have got is we have passed this request payload. As soon as this it reaches on in Unqork, all these things gets wrapped under this variable which is called as underscore request. And further we have triggered this particular data workflow where we are grabbing that part which is underscore request, and from underscore request we are getting we are going towards body and then to request. So whenever a webhook is called, right, whenever this kind of a webhook we are building, underscore request and body, this is a constant part. What would be the variable part is what we are putting here, right? So if I put here a different variable again, which I will call it as test. Okay, let's put something, and test abc. I know, pretty bad name, but yeah, let's try. And now if I want to grab this test variable from a request payload instead of request body, because I know underscore request and body is constant, and inside the body we will be having two things, one is request payload and then the test. So I will pass it here as test and save it. Now if you see in response, let me see what's the issue. Oh, I think it is not saved somehow. It happens in Unqork, so no issues. Let me put it test here, save this, save again. Let's see now if it works. Or yeah, it worked, it saved properly, and now we are grabbing this test attribute from the request payload that the system have passed, and we have sent this back again. So this is how the webhook works. So if you have any questions on this, please comment on this video. I will surely reply back all those comments. and let's meet in the next video with more topics on webhook, and also we'll just go ahead with new operators. Thank you.